Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ankita from NASSCOM. I'm beginning my June Skill Dev sessions with an interesting webinar from our product management series. Today's topic is all about how to measure right. I have with me Rohit Chhapolia, who is head of products at X to 10X. Session's flow will be Rohit will present for about 40 to 45 minutes, followed by the Q&A session. You can ask questions anytime during the session. Do not forget to leave your feedback to help me better my future webinars. Welcome, Rohit, and over to you.
Thank you, Ankita, and hello to everybody. Thanks for joining this webinar. Let me kind of start talking about the topic measuring right, and what I plan to cover into this is when you take the metrics for any product, almost all the products, you're going to have metrics, and there's always a set of questions around which metrics do I take, and do I have too many metrics? Do I have too few metrics? What's the right set of metrics? There's always those concerns, and measuring each and every metric requires significant effort, requires investment in the technology, requires investment into setting up the dashboards to make the measurements, and one needs to make a careful trade-off. Is it worth making that investment? So today's session, we will discuss some of those ideas which make your metrics far more powerful, far more right. So this is the legal disclaimer part of the template. We flash it and move on. So let's start by something part of a very popular book on Agile by Scott Graffius. And I'm sure at some level, we all would identify with this statement. The constant choice of the tension that we have, that do we have too few metrics or do we have too many metrics? Correct. Now, today's session, I do not plan to give an overall structure of the metrics. It's a huge topic, and we can spend quite some time talking through it. But what I plan to do is give few specific ideas, kind of rule of thumb rules to get you more out of your metrics. I'm happy to take any questions that you may have each and every idea as we go through. There are 6 ideas actually, and then I'm happy to take any questions on those, and of course any broader questions or any other questions at the end of the webinar also. So let's we go to the first idea. The first idea we talk about is North Star metrics. Now, what does it mean? The key challenge every product manager faces is that how do I take my decisions? Now, every product manager faces a lot of choices they need to make. They could be at a very small level in terms of, do I allow user to click here, or I allow user to not click here? Or it could be something about, do I insert an ad slot or do I not insert an ad slot? Right? The choices can vary from very tactical stuff to something much more strategic in nature. And how do you make those choices? And that's where the North Star metrics help. These are essentially 2 or 3 metrics that you need to identify and say, these are the current goals for my product, and be mindful of the business objectives. So if there's a revenue goal, if it's important at this stage of your product, do include that. But do not have too many, because of the second point is that the idea behind these metrics, the purpose of these metrics is that you align them across the organization, and everybody believes and agrees that these are the metrics we are optimizing for. And then once you have that one-time alignment, which can, by the way, take few iterations with all the stakeholders when you do that alignment. But once you have that alignment, you are not struggling for each and every trade-off that you are discussing. You essentially have to now align, evaluate every product decision on these metrics. And then you are essentially saying, look, let me give an example. So for example, let's say in early stage of the product, the key metric is number of active customers. Now let's say that's the North Star metric that you select. Now, you essentially, once you have aligned that that's what we are going for, every product decision you are taking is optimized for increasing the number of active customers. And as a product manager, you'll always have resource constraints and there'll be various choices. And there are a lot of these trade-offs. So for example, it may come to a trade-off between, do I increase time spent by current users? We're talking about very early stage of a product, or do I focus on acquiring more customers? Now, ideally, of course, as a product manager, we would like to do both. But if you have resource constraint and you have aligned that we are going to prioritize number of active customers, then it helps in making trade-offs and saying, we'll focus on features which increase the number of active customers. And that's the idea behind these metrics. Some other examples could be like revenue is, of course, one of them. It could be usage per customer. The usage itself could be measured by different set of metrics depending on the product you have. So it could be that and various other metrics that depending on your product you might have. The other important point is the North Star metrics do not remain constant during the product phase. As your product evolves, as you go from the trial phase where usage may be more important, then you go in growth phase where the number of active customers or number of new customers may be more important, to when you go to a more stable stage where the as the customer base has built up and you have large number of active customers, then retention can start becoming important. Revenue can start becoming important. So the North Star metrics will change as your product journey evolves. So that's about North Star metrics. Now, having brought that concept, the question that comes to my mind and a lot of product managers is, look, I have various trade-offs to make in my product. How do I ensure that while optimizing for one, I am not creating a very adverse impact on other metrics? And that's where the second set of metrics come. You need to think about what are these key trade-offs which are involved as part of your product. A very typical trade-off, I have led advertising, managed advertising for Amazon India. And we used to always have this trade-off between customer engagement on the platform versus monetization by having ad slots. Right? And
Rohit, we have a question.
Sure.
Yeah, so there's this question by Pooja. She's asking, so should we not start by focusing on retention first?
Okay. So I would say it depends on how you have defined your product journey. If you are in a very early phase, now the metrics, the causality needs to be established, and I'll come to that in the next slide. But the question in the very early phase, when you're in the trial phase, is the usage is often an indicator of the retention. If the product is being used more often, then you know that the customer will remain. And retention becomes more of an output metric. So very early phase, you might say that I am going to focus on usage and see if I'm able to drive that. So you might have only 50 customers if it's a, let's say if it's a B2B SaaS kind of product, you might have only 5 customers in the early phase. And as a customers, as companies, retention is very difficult to measure in that case. Versus if you have, let's say, even a B2C product, you might be starting trial with 1,000 people, and they might be, very carefully selected 1,000 people. And then they may stick around because you have given them certain incentive to use the product. So it depends on how you have set up the product. But I would argue, in general, usage is the more important metric in the very early trial phase. Okay, so so continuing with the balanced set of metrics. So again, the idea is that you identify these key trade-offs that you have to make in product. Now, what you will keep seeing is metrics do not exist in isolation. They are a function of your product, and they are a function of the product journey that you want. So it's difficult for me to say here, look, these are the trade-offs. I can give 1 or 2 examples of typical trade-offs. For example, customer engagement versus monetization when you want to bring in an ad slot. Correct. But you need to take a decision, which are those key trade-offs in your product, and identify those. And then, of course, the next point is think about metrics that measure both sides of these trade-offs. You might have revenue versus maybe CTR, the click-through rates, to figure out, am I doing the right thing on that slot? For example, if you take search results, organic search results may have higher CTRs, and then you put an ad slot, the CTRs might drop, but then those ad slots give you money, correct? So you are perhaps trading off to make money. You are trading off the customer engagement, customer experience piece of it. But then you are mindful of the choice that you are making. And that's the third point, correct? But then you need to be mindful if you are getting organic CTRs of, say, 10% on the top result, and then you insert an ad slot, and your CTR drops to, say, 1%, and that's a significant drop. And you may say, look, that's not acceptable for me to run ads. I need to increase ad relevance. Versus saying that my CTR is 6.5%, and then you might say that, look, that is degradation I'm willing to accept. So again, that's a choice you need to make, but you can do that when you're measuring both of these metrics. Now, the other thing is be careful that as your product evolves, some more trade-offs may emerge. I'll give an example that, let's say if you're trying to build an e-commerce site and you are offering people to go to the product detail page and then add the product to the cart. And now if you give an add to cart button in the search results page, now what happens is perhaps the conversion will go up. More people will add the product to cart right in the search results page. They don't need to go to product details page anymore. But then what will happen is if you have ad slots on the product detail page, that traffic is going down and you're losing that amount of money. So that's a new trade-off which comes as the product is being built when you insert that button. And then you need to be mindful of that trade-off and decide, look, I'm going to take that.
Rohit, we have a question.
Sure, Ankita.
By Sakshi. She's saying how to set benchmarks for metrics.
Yeah, that's a question often comes. The benchmarks, you can, of course, have it two ways. One is your internal benchmarks, correct? But for that, you need to have some data from your own, you should have a product running for some period of time, and then you can say, look, this is the best I have achieved, and if I launch something new and it degrades subsequently, then you can easily measure that. The other is, of course, finding the parallels from outside, correct? And for that you need to figure out, some places it might be easier if you're building, let's say, a grocery website, then you will perhaps talk to your friends in other companies who are building similar products and talk to them. I don't think there is any guidebook of benchmarks. Even search results, the first search result should have 70% click through, or should it have 10%, or should it have 3%, which is right? I think it totally depends on what you're building. I think it's difficult to say that first search result should have so much CTRs. No easy answer, unfortunately.
Thanks, Rohit, for your answer. We can proceed now.
Okay, thank you. Cool. So we talk about balancing these metrics, and then I go to the next set, which I kind of talked about, is leading indicators. Leading indicators are essentially like these signs, right, which tell you that there's a potential for something good or bad as you go ahead. It doesn't necessarily mean it must be there, but it's a high chance that you will reach there. So some of you are also familiar with the concept of input metrics and output metrics. What you will see is leading indicators will typically be input metrics. And the one important criteria for leading indicators is that it should be highly correlated to output, and it should be changing, not a day before the output changes, correct? But it should be changing significantly. And I'll come to the definition of significant and before the output changes. Now, why do we look at leading indicators? Is the point number 3. Basically, 3 and 4. Your initiatives will essentially be defined on these metrics. So if I take an example, in telecom, it's very well understood that before people churn out, they disconnect their connection, the usage starts dropping. They don't decide on one fine day that, okay, I'm going to change. Most of the cases, again, leading indicators are not 100% correlated with the output. And also the drop in the usage may not necessarily mean I'm going to churn. It may just be that I'm on vacation or traveling or something. But it's a highly correlated. So if you start seeing the drop in the usage, that's where you start taking an action, correct? The action could be to understand, who are these customers? Are they churning? Because you can even do a survey with them, and you can figure out, are they churning because your service is not good? Are they churning because the prices are no more competitive, or they have too many service interruptions which is taking place? So if you start measuring these leading indicators, it allows you to take initiatives on these indicators, and it also allows you to be proactive. So it's not that people have churned and then now you are going to be reactive to say, can I bring them back? Or they have asked for portability, number portability, and now you're saying, okay, let me have a process to retain them for the 24 hours I got to before I have to approve their application. So it gives you far more time, and that's what is significant, correct? The significant should be which gives you enough time to take action. And that depends on how much time you need. and accordingly you define the significance. So you can look for a metric. Of course, there's no guarantee you will always find the leading indicator, but look for one. And if you find that's great. It allows you to take some actions in advance, and also allows you to be establish yourself as proactive in the organization, right? Which makes the later pain points much lesser. Other final point is leading indicators can be both positive or negative. Don't only look for negative. Sometimes you may find that, for example, you may find that people who in an e-commerce site, again, people who shop across various categories, they tend to come back more often. So if somebody is like doing 5 transactions in last 3 months, and they're all in the same category versus across categories, people who did same 5 transactions across categories are likely to come back more often in the next month. Right? Then that's a leading indicator, positive leading indicator, how many people are doing across categories. And now what you do is you can build an initiative which says if 50% of people have transacted only in one category, can I incentivize them to transact across category, do a transaction in a different category? And you can even, in fact, if you spend enough time analyzing, you can even kind of estimate how much downstream benefit you're going to get out of it. Amazon uses a metric called downstream impact, DSI, which is essentially built on this concept. So these are leading indicators. Hello, Ankita, can you hear me? I'm getting some warning here that my network is low.
Yeah, I can hear you. There was some issue. Now it's fine. Your webcam is also not very clear, Rohit, right now.
Hello.
Yeah, Rohit, can you hear me?
Because I just got some the network issue. Should I just switched off my
now
webcam.
Your voice
is it better
clear.
now?
Yeah, it's better. It's better.
Okay, perfect. Okay. So that's the leading indicators. Then yes. So next, I'll go to the concept of when you're looking for metrics for your product, think about the need for proxy metrics. And the proxy metrics essentially, sometimes there are an idea or a concept that you want to measure, and it's either impossible to measure that, or it's pretty expensive in terms of building the right technology, right ways to measure it, or asking customers to do something which will generate that data is difficult. So in that case, look for metrics which are easy to measure and they come close to original. Now, I'm not a big fan of proxy metrics. I'm more stickler to saying, I don't want to make any compromises in my products. I would rather measure what I want to measure. But then you, as a product manager, always have to make choices. And one of the choices is, am I going to settle for a proxy metric if it makes fits fast and it saves me resources, which otherwise can be used to build features which impact my North Star. Right? So, but of course, the metric has to be correlated to what you're trying to, the original concept you're trying to measure. So if I give an example, if you want to measure time spent by user on a website, to measure as a measure of engagement. Now, any of you have tried that, you will figure out, you know that it's very difficult. It's difficult because you know when people visit your website, but you don't know when they leave your website. And most of the time you will assume some session value and then say that every visit means so much time. So that's where the proxies are coming in. You're actually not measuring the start and the end time. You can't ask your users that, hey, when you leave my website, you must press an end button. They're not going to do that. So you start making some approximations there. And then you say, essentially what you're doing is the number of visits, number of sessions is a proxy because the time becomes a multiplier. Essentially what you're measuring is number of visits. So that's the proxy you have started using for time spent. Similarly, if you may find that there is a gap into that when I take the visits, it's not giving me very good idea of how much time people spend. So maybe my assumptions about every visit translates to 30 minutes. They're not good, or X number of minutes that you may come to. So you might also look for number of actions they take or the last action they take. What's the time between the first visit and the last action they take on the website? And that could also be a proxy in terms of the actual time spent. Now, of course, we can imagine situations where a user might have, opened your website, did few things, gone for lunch, comes back, and then, does another couple of things on the website. And, depending on how long you assume the session to be, you might find that the actual time spent is much more than they actually did. But those are going to be edge cases, not most of the cases, and hence your proxy is more and more closer to the actual behavior. So that's essentially an example of a proxy metrics. So again, I would strongly encourage each of you to think about what is the original concept, be mindful of that, and then see, is there a cheaper, currently available way to measure it, and how much is a trade-off I'm making in the what I want to measure and what this metric represents. Next is diving deep. We talked about most of the metrics which are at the top level and at the product level. We all have run into issues that you're seeing certain behavior, you're seeing certain trends, and you want to explain it as metrics that you see at the top level, and you can't find a good answer to it. And the real insights come when you go deeper, and then you really find all those, like this Corel, the beautiful things which are there, which is actually giving you insights which you can do something with. So that's the key point. Often I've run into those averages which you see. They do not represent anything. They do not represent any customer. Think about, I'm sure you'll find 20% of your customers represent 80% of, that 20-80 happens in almost all products. They do 80% of value, 80% of transactions, 80% of engagement, and remaining 80% do 20% of it. What you're seeing is the average, and there's nobody there. You need to de-average so that you can actually find whether the pain point is with these 20% customers who drive 80% behavior, or if these 80% of customers who contribute 20%. Right? Or you could actually de-average data in multiple ways. Some of the common ways that I have found useful during my product journey is customer segments, traffic source, is the traffic coming from a search engine behaving differently than the traffic which is coming directly to your app or your website. right? And if you de-average, you might find the average is being impacted because of adverse impact on one or these. And then the process steps. The process steps could think about people who are, let's say if you find suddenly that there are more returns coming, then you need to de-average that why the returns are happening. Is it coming from people who are prepaid? Are this coming from people who are postpaid? And then people who are, you can even have location. Is it coming from, or which will be covered in customer segments? Essentially, people who are in tier 1 cities or tier 2 cities or beyond that. So again, when you take any of the data, we intuitively do that. I just wanted to make it very explicit thought process here and give some tips around how you can dive deeper and the need for identify these metrics. Now, the concern with dive deep metrics is, should you do it only when the need arises as a one-off analysis, or should you always have it in your dashboard? Right? The approach I take often is first time do it when the need arises, but then automate these metrics and have these being populated. But then those are backups that I don't spend time on until the top level metric tells me there is something going wrong. Right? And then that is essentially, when I want to now investigate what's going wrong, then I go to these backup dashboards and start looking at the de-average values. And the last point is, again, I would say is this is not so much of a metric, but something about when you are starting to make decisions based on your metric, interpretations of your metric. Be mindful that sometimes you might see customer behavior on your site, and you need to carefully examine if that's representative of the broader market or not. For example, if you're running, think about online medical consultation website, you might see certain behavior in terms of number of consultations done by somebody, let's say in the last 3 months. And it may turn out, you might say that that's what represents the the customer segment if you see that pattern. But actually, when you go and see the broader market, people would be doing offline consultations as well. So the what's happening on the website or the app or by the service may not be representative of the market. And it's important to understand where those gaps are. And the difference often comes either because the customer mix is different, which is, for example, if you take, say, e-commerce itself, you might find that tier 1 cities, people use it more than the smaller cities, and hence the general population mix and e-commerce mix would be different, or it could come from their intent. So, for example, people who go to a shopping mall may have different conversions, different mix of products they buy than people who visit an e-commerce site. And that's not just the site experience, that may also happen because of when they go to these places, they have a different intent to begin with. So that could again create a difference between what the overall market is and what is the behavior of your customers. And how do you understand that is, of course, your data will not help you understand that. So you need to do some kind of customer research to, to discover the broader behavior and then see what is happening for the same set of customers, what is happening on your side, and then try to understand the gaps in the differences. And then perhaps you can extrapolate that in a careful fashion, but extrapolate that to the rest of the population on your website. So that's about the interpretation of these metrics when you're trying to extrapolate them. So that's those are the 6, essentially, if I recap, 6 suggestions, thumb rules, I would say, is when you're looking at your metrics, look for North Star metrics, have balance set, look for leading indicators, find proxies, have your dive deep, understand how you need to cut your data, and be careful about how you extrapolate your data you have to the market, the behavior of overall general behavior of customers. So that's what I have. Happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Rohit. Thank you for the session. So the first question for our Q&A round is, if we are building a completely new productive service, how do we know what would be the appropriate DAU/MAU where there is no similar product/service?
Okay. So the way I would approach that is, first is you need to identify what is, even in the business case, what is the market you're going after. Like, so for example, let's say I'm building a new product which is for running a webinar, let's say, right? Now, you have to do some, you can do secondary research, you can do primary research to figure out as part of the business case that, what is the market size for webinars? How many webinars are done in a month? How many people are organizers? How many participants? You have to start from there. Now, often, most of the times, if you look around, you'll find some secondary data itself, which is typically right at a certain scale. And that's good enough to, often say that, it's like 1 million webinars happening every month. It's kind of your benchmark, or not the benchmark, rather the potential. And now when you're starting, right, you need to set your ambition. Of course, you can't say that I'm going to hit 10% of that in 6 months, or you may actually. Now I think otherwise, depends on how aggressive your growth plans are. But you need to define those ambitions and then set your DAU, MAU targets from there. So it's about estimating the market size, defining your ambition, and then you are saying, look, how do I trend across? So it's all outside in. There is no inside out data to help you establish that. So it's more driven by what I want it to be, the aspiration of where I want it to be, and do not be disappointed if you don't hit that.
All right. Thanks, Rohit, for that answer. The next question is by Rohit Nagpal. In case you want to incentivize someone to shop in other categories, which category do you incentivize when you don't have any prior data?
Yeah, interesting. Okay, the way I would approach that, the very first thing is, so let's say there are 3 categories, and I'll make up, let's say, smartphones and shoes, and third category I'll make is, let's say, grocery, right? And now you find a lot of people are buying smartphones, but they haven't bought anything else. And where do I incentivize them to? The incentivization should depend on the return that you're going to get for that, right? And if you find that the people who buy smartphones, now look for the natural flow. Which category do they tend to buy next when I don't do any incentivization, right? So if I find that 30% of smartphone users buy shoes, but only 10% of them end up buying grocery, then I know that there is something happening which is, making my platform more attractive for the smartphone buyers to buy shoes, right? It could be the fact that in both these cases they're willing to wait for some time. Could be the fact that you don't have to have a cart building experience, whatever. but that's the important point, correct? Now you need to build hypotheses around why that behavior is happening, why the smartphone users would end up buying shoes more often, correct? Why there's more overlap there. And once you understand, which may require talking to some of these users and getting the insights from them. Of course, also talking to users who buy a smartphone and shop in grocery and understand why they do that. And then once you understand that, which gives you comfort that this is a good insight, that will help you now designing your programs, designing your incentives, and designing your messaging to these users to say, where do I go next? The final thing I would say is also experiment. Maybe experiment with an incentive that you at a much lower scale to people for these categories and see which one tends to perform better. Right? If you don't get a very good insight from the data itself, and then see which one performs better and double down on that one.
Thanks, Rohit, for this answer. The next question is by Biplav. He's saying, which among the categories of matrix a PM should monitor on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah. So, I mean, look, the North Star metrics I would see every day. It's like, I chose this image. Of course, I got it from internet somewhere. It's not one of my own dashboards. But it's almost like setting up your page 0 dashboard, right? And I would say page 0 dashboard, I would have somewhere between 15 to 20 metrics, not less, not more. And I'll tell you, that is the ideal number. It's also from the perspective of human cognitive abilities that when we see those many numbers, we are able to retain the trends across the days and do something meaningful. If you have too few, you may not be getting the real issues, as we talked about. Like, if you only have North Star metrics and you don't have balanced metrics or leading indicators, you might be missing something which is going to happen. It's like tsunami is going to come, but you don't know. And then if you have too many, you just spend so much time analyzing the metrics that you are left, you're too tired to now think about what should I do about it, correct? Also, if you have too many, this means you haven't figured out your prioritization. What is your focus? So the act of arriving at those 15 to 20 metrics is, in my mind, the right balance, that you have enough of these metrics across these categories and you don't have too many so that you're losing focus. So that is the rule of thumb I have.
All right. Shrinjani has a question for you, Rohit. Can you specify some tools that can be used for measurement?
So, look, metrics measurement end-to-end, there are tons of tools and it's a pretty complex area, lots of choices. Now there are, I would say, 3 set of things that you need to do in the metrics area. One is instrumentation of your product so that the right data is being collected. So that's the first part. Google Analytics is pretty common, but of course, there are enough number of companies who build their own instrumentation logic, their own instrumentation library, and then use it. I'm sure there are other options, so I'm not going to promote one or other, but there are a lot of choices, which is about collecting or rather generating the data itself. The second part you need to think about is how the data is stored and it's like the repository itself, right? And again, there are lots of databases from S3 in AWS to so many more, Oracle. So there are tons of these. And but the main important point is you need to think about where am I storing my data so that I can access it easily when I need to. And the third part of it is, which is the real instrumentation, correct? Something like what you see here on the slide. And there are again softwares which basically will allow you to build a logic from your data warehouse to how you represent them on these screens. Correct? Tableau is one of them. AWS has, I think it's called QuickSight. I think Adobe has a few products. So there are tons of these products. I don't think there is like one particular product which is like the benchmark and says like you must use this. I think it all depends on what you're trying to do and you evaluate them. But to recap, there are three things you need to be mindful of when you're building your end-to-end metric system. One is data generation, data repository, and then data presentation.
All right, Rohit, Biplav has a question in continuation. He's saying
Okay.
also many times a lot of North Star metric depends on a lot of non-product KPIs of other teams. How to deal with them?
Okay, I'm trying to imagine the context, which teams and why. Look, I think if it is from the business team, as I called out, you have to be, a product manager cannot, completely ignore the business metrics. So taking something like revenue as a North Star metric that you are optimizing for is a perfectly valid choice. Now, I'm imagining maybe one could be that, let's say if you're running some kind of hosting service, you could say that cost control is one of the things, and my big cost is the server cost, and hence I'm going to optimize to make the software faster, so consume less memory, so that I can reduce my cost, correct? And that's valid, but it's not there because the tech team is saying that, hey, that's what I want. They may originate the ask, but as a product manager, you need to evaluate is, given the business case for your product, given what is expected, the objectives or the goals of your product, right? Is that a metric that fits in? Now, if from the senior leadership, your goal is that, hey, I want to see the revenue growth, top line growth, and your tech team is pushing you to have a North Star metric, which is about reducing the hosting cost, you need to challenge that. Do not accept it. Right? But if your senior leaders are saying that, look, we need to make the profitable and bring down the cost, and one of the leading costs is the hosting cost or the server cost, then that's part of the solutioning. You will say that, yes, this is an area we need to bring down costs on. And difficult to answer without specific context, but I hope this helps in terms of thought process.
Sure, thanks, Rohit. I hope, Biplav, your question is answered. Venkat has a question. How do you measure the ROI of a feature if individual SKU is not monetized?
Sorry, Ankita, can you please?
Shall I repeat the question? Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
How do you measure the ROI? How do you measure the ROI of a feature if individual SKU is not monetized?
Okay. So I would measure ROI in the context of North Star metrics. In fact, in my mind, that's why the North Star metrics is. Now, if it is monetization, it is very easy for everybody to understand. I launch something, I do A/B test, I can establish that because of this, there is increase in monetization, and that's my ROI. But if your North Star metric is number of new customers, you can do the same. It's just a math. Right? You can say that before I launched this feature, I was acquiring 200 customers per day, and after I launch, I'm acquiring 350 customers per day. So that incremental 150 is from this feature. I'm doing a very simple causality. In reality, the life is not so simple. So take it with a pinch of salt. But to keep it simple, I say incremental 150 is because of this feature. And that's your ROI. Now, why do we use ROI? We use ROI to compare between the two choices. Do I put my money here or do I put my money somewhere else? So if you're thinking about two features, you're going to compare them on the same ROI. Let's say you do a pilot of two features and to decide which one I scale up. Then you need to measure them on same impact, which is which one of them gives me more new customers, right? And then decide which one I scale up. So it could be used for money, it could be used for non-monetary metrics as well.
Thanks, Rohit. Abhijit has a question. How OKRs can be tied to the 6 metrics mentioned in the presentation? OKRs would be a part of each of these metrics?
I would say, look, the OKRs would typically tie to the first one. When you're defining your objectives, top level objectives for the product, they should be tied to the North Star metrics. Right? And it's very simple. If you say that, look, my focus is on bringing down cost, then that's your North metric, and that's your the top level OKR. Now, when you do the solutioning, when you start converting that objective to KRs, and I mean, we haven't yet gone into how OKRs work, but for the benefit of you and the other audience who understands OKR, you start doing solutioning, which will say, look, to bring down cost, just to build on previous example, I will look at all my various cost elements. And if I say hosting cost is one area where I want to bring down, then you say, look, one of my KR is to bring down hosting cost by 30%. Other could be, I want to bring down my customer acquisition cost by 30%, or you could identify another couple of buckets, and then you start doing solutioning. And each of these, as you are doing the solutioning, you're identifying the metrics. Right? Now, those metrics, they don't necessarily align with these 6. As I said, these 6 are not a framework to give you a complete set of metrics. These 6 are more like, rule of thumb to ensure that the metrics you have identified are right. So you could even say that next KR, which is about bringing down the hosting cost, you could still have balanced set of metrics for that. That there's a cost reduction of that, but I'm also monitoring the web response time. Right? Am I decreasing, the cost so much? Am I reducing the resources so much that the peak load, the response times becomes bad, right? And that's the choice then you need to make. Am I willing to live with that degraded response time for the cost savings I'm doing? So it will still apply there. The concept would apply at each level.
There's a part B of this question, Rohit, which is how the go-to-market plan is influenced by the matrix.
To me, when you identify the initiatives in your go-to-market plan, those initiatives you need to have a judgment. If you don't have prior data to give a strong causality, at least you need to have a judgment call that how will those initiatives influence these metrics, especially again the now look, the go-to-market plan would not probably impact each and everything. The go-to-market plan typically focuses on customer acquisition, and that would be or retention. Right? So that would be one of the facets. Similarly, as like you say, tech would control few parts of it, right? That as a cost element, and then the rest is all about delivery. But again, the GTM will influence some of these metrics, not all of them. Now, once the customer is on the product, their own behavior will actually mean a lot more in terms of the metrics that you see.
Thanks, Rohit. Next question is by Apabrita Biswas. I'm looking to set up a close consumer community to do A/B testing, get on ground feedback on new launches, and increase brand friendship. How do I set up the success matrix for this, where my objective is consumer engagement?
I think the clue to the answer is in your question. If your objective is consumer engagement, when you do now again, the consumer engagement can be measured in different ways. You could say again, without knowing the specific of the product, difficult to say, but I'll give some ideas from what I have done. It could be CTRs, it could be like how many clicks or actions people take with your product. That could be a measure of engagement, could be time spent. If you're building some kind of a video product or building some kind of video product, time spent is much more possible. If you're building some kind of blog, you might say how many people visit, and then you could say how many people read till the end. That's a measure of engagement. You could also see how many, if you have a sharing is important part of experience in your product, then you could see, the real engagement. If something, what I have appeals, then people will share that, and then that could be an engagement metric. So difficult to say without understanding the product. But yeah, sorry, I can't go more specific than that. I think these are some of the ideas I can put, broad list of ideas.
Sure, thanks, Rohit. Next question is, if my site has a high bounce rate, how should I go about knowing the reasons behind it?
Okay. Yeah, the analysis of these metrics is a whole field by itself. But how do I analyze the high bounce rates? And so I think it's a very tricky problem. I would first thing I would say is to do a survey. Right? Why are you leaving? It's like when you unsubscribe from an email that you consider spammy, and then they ask you this question, correct? Please tell us why you are unsubscribing. And whenever I see that question, I always feel amused that, look, first I thought your email is spamming, and now you're asking me why, one more question before I unsubscribe, correct? At least in this case, they have a choice. They can force me to say that we don't unsubscribe you unless you answer the question. When people bounce, how do you make them, respond to your survey? But some of them may. Correct. In one of the I remember products, what we tried is we created a list of 100 such customers, and we had their phone numbers, and we just started calling them. There was not so much about bounce, but it was more about, like, think about you're doing transactions and you stop doing transactions. So you became inactive customers, and we call them, why are you inactive, to understand. Correct. I mean, it's a far more involved analysis. You have to look at the behavioral patterns across their subsequent activities. What have they done before coming to the page where they bounce off? Yeah, it's. I mean, if in a smaller setup where I understand more, I can talk more about it, but it's difficult to give a generic answer to it.
Sure, Rohit, understandable. So this question by Dinesh Durai will be the last question of our session for today. So it is, can we have metrics for B2B product and role of AI in it?
Yes, the first one is easy. We can have metrics for B2B products. You can define your customers as number of companies. You could, but that's more of a sales and marketing kind of thing. You could also define your metrics as number of active customers, and which are basically employees of these companies. That's very much possible. You might also look at, one of the things I would look for is the decision to buy the product and the employee engagement is unlike where the buying decision is taken by each customer in a B2C. B2B, it's the aggregate behavior which would translate to 0, 1 at the company level, whether we keep the product or not, correct? And so look for each employee's behavior and see if most of them are above the desired threshold or not. I think in B2B cases, the customer survey also becomes important to get some more insights about how all employees of a company are thinking about it. So always de-average. So in fact, when we're talking about dive deep, de-averaging at the company level becomes important in a B2B case. Second one is a difficult question, the role of AI. I think one could have the whole webinar on AI and maybe much more. I'm not an expert in AI, so I will not even make an attempt to answer that question.
All right, thanks, Rohit. Thank you for this wonderful session. Thank you so much, Rohit, for your time and efforts. And I'm sure everyone like me must have enjoyed your session and learned something new today. And for everyone out here, for the audience, I will meet all of you on 10th of June with another session from the Product Marketing Management series, where focus will be on what makes it difficult for the transition from services to products for the Indian product ecosystem, for the Indian IT ecosystem per se. For more information and registration, please visit nasscom.in/events. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Rohit. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Thank you, Ankita, and thanks to all the participants. I hope you got something meaningful out of it.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Bye-bye.